Posso começar, Emily?
Por favor.
So, good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank IDP and especially, of course, Cesar for the invitation and the privilege of presenting and moderating this panel. This panel will address the effects of Brazil's adhesion to GPA. As an administrative law professor, I really have many doubts about the really benefits that this good agreement to bring to us, especially considering two following facts. The first one, we have a large number of small companies. Actually, it's possible to say that our economy depends on small businesses. And most part of the jobs, or I could assume the majority of the jobs come from the small companies. They are responsible for the majority of all jobs. And the second, and for me, a really important point, a really important issue regards our legal system. Since the Constitution of 1988, our Constitution protects this kind of enterprises. In fact, there is a principle that establishes and guarantees a preferential treatment to this kind of companies. In addition to that, the Constitution forces all public entities to offer a legal special treatment in order to stimulate their creation and their survival. In Brazil, regardless of what we already know about the Constitution, we have, in addition to that, a special and very important law which focuses on small business. This law requires total or partial set-asides to protect, to favor this kind of companies. And even more than this, when all enterprises are allowed to participate in the bidding process, this sort of companies will still receive an exclusive treatment. I'm talking about the most relevant advantage that will bring a differential treatment to this kind of companies. It is related to a situation when a large company and a small one, they tie in their bid amount. And in this situation, the law favors the less powerful company, let's say that way. So in my opinion, the biggest issue is how to still protect our economy, our small companies, and when and if they have to fight against big companies, or more than this, big non-domestic ones. I know, I do not ignore that is room for negotiation, but the billion-dollar question is if we will be capable of addressing our interests, if we will be capable of protecting our economy. So now, without further comments, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Professor Annamaria Lachimia, com il suo bellissimo cognome italiano. Professor Annamaria Lachimia is Professor of Law and Development and Director of the Public Procurement Research Group at the University of Nottingham. She also leads the university's Rights and Justice Research Priority Area, and she is the school's Equality Officer and co-chair of the Equality and Diversity Program. So we have the pleasure of listening to you, Professor Lachimia. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Cristiana. Thank you for this introduction. I think you really have brought to the fore some that are the major concerns for Brazil accession to the GPA. But hopefully, today with this seminar, we will manage to clarify some of the issues that you raised, because these are legitimate concerns, but at the same time are concerns that can be addressed within the rules, can be addressed by having a good team of negotiators and by interpreting and looking at the rules of the GPA and the practice that has been implemented so far by GPA parties. Now, on 18 May 2020, Brazil has lodged a request to the WTO Committee on Government Procurement to start negotiations on joining the GPA. And Brazil is the first Latin American economy seeking to join the GPA. And its application for accession has correctly been defined as an historical event. Now, from a development perspective, Brazil accession to the GPA could have significant implications for Brazil itself, implications for the global South more generally, and for the role that the GPA can play in terms of alluring other developing countries to join the GPA. And so the GPA can really acclaim itself, anoint as the international standards for procurement regulations. International standards that already is, because many international bilateral agreements already comply with the GPA rules, but it is particularly significant the fact that a big developing country such as Brazil joins the GPA, makes a request to join the GPA. I mean, there are other developing countries that are members to the GPA, but Brazil is certainly a very big developing country, and it is the first Latin American country. So the possibility, the horizon of possibilities is really widened now with this accession. And when we think about the development impact that the GPA will have, I'm sure that most of you will soon think about whether Brazil will be able to continue to use procurement to pursue social, environmental, and industrial policy, exactly as you were pointing out, Cristiana. But this is not the only impact. And I know that Luke later on after me will talk about the possibility to protect SMEs, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but I want to bring to the fore other possible impacts that need to be considered. Brazil, the path of negotiations that Brazil will follow will not only have a significant impact on Brazil's ability to continue to pursue such policies, but it will also affect the choices that Brazil will make in terms of structural reforms of its procurement system and of its administrative apparatus. In Brazil, so in that perspective, I think that's also something that we need to consider. So Brazil accession will also be significant for the global South more generally, because it is an important developing country. Now, when we look, for example, at the role that the GPA can play in terms of the Brazilian internal system, we can think of a number of possibilities, a number of impacts that the GPA will have. For example, there are three aspects that I would like to highlight in particular. The accession to the GPA will be a stimulus for reforming the national procurement framework. But what will this mean for development? What will this mean for efficiency, for transparency, for saving of the public purse, and hence for the capacity of Brazil to use its money more efficiently and to be able to buy more with the funds available. So we need to think about this, especially when we think about the significance of the accession of Brazil to the GPA. So this adherence to international standards requires compliance, requires structural reforms that will have an impact a broader impact on societies, so on the legal system. So, for example, when Brazil was granted observer status by GPA parties in October 2017, at the time, Brazil said that its request reflected a desire from the Brazilian people to modernize the economy and improve the management of public resources. So this is definitely an element that needs to be considered, and I will come back to this. Then the second element that I think is important and we need to consider is whether complying with the GPA rules might affect Brazil's capacity to use procurement as a development tool to support SME environmental policies. And it is noteworthy that procurement can be used as a leverage to stimulate environmental policies, social policies, to support innovation, to support SMEs, and has long been used in this sense in developing and developed countries. And GPA parties continue to do so. Think about the Buy American policy, or think about the environmental policies of Europe, or think about the South African policies for minority groups. South Africa, sorry, is not a good example because it's not yet a party to the GPA, but think about the two major parties to the GPA, the EU and the US, that both use substantially procurement to promote other policies, those so-called horizontal policies. So to many extent, we can say that this use is already quite acclaimed. And there should be no scaremongering or fears that the GPA will prevent such use. But also, I think another important element that we need to consider is that what does it mean for donors, if anything? What does it mean for donors to know that Brazil's framework complies with the GPA? So will this lead, for example, to more use of country system by donors? This is another important element. And if this were to be the case, and I would say that if I were a negotiator for Brazil, I would really push for this to happen. Then if this were to be the case, we could really see some significant benefit from Brazil's accession to the GPA. And I have to say another thing. Brazil had already negotiated government procurement chapters in regional and bilateral free trade agreements, which are based largely on the provisions of the GPA. Hence, its willingness to open up procurement to external competition is not per se a novelty. So Brazil's request for accession to the GPA signals its intention to go farther. So in a way to move away from just the regional integration, which I think could have significant benefit. But at the same time, I think there is something else we need to think about. The fact that Brazil's request is happening now at this very time is especially important. You know, the request came on the 18th of May 2020, when the world and Brazil are devastated by the COVID pandemic that has exposed first the shortcomings of international trade agreements and their incapacity to prevent states from competing with each other to secure medical equipment, and that seems now instead to have induced at least some states to prefer collaboration over individualism. And as significant in this respect, for example, the effort of the EU countries to form new procurement alliances, to work together, to purchase new equipment and a vaccine together, or the efforts of the African countries. So can we see this, for example, can we see this request of access as a willingness to cooperate? Should we read it along those lines? So, which I think are quite important. Now, when we think about the implications for Brazil, I was telling you that there are 3 types of implications from a development perspective that we should note. And I'm conscious that I'm nearly run out of time already, but you know, let's just focus on the implications for Brazil. I mean, on the WTO website, it is stated, for example, in very simple but very clear terms, that the GPA aims to open up government procurement market to foreign competition in a reciprocal manner and to the extent agreed between GPA parties. and it aims to create more transparent procurement system and to promote good governance. So the reciprocal access will lead to better price and better value for money. So from this point of view, therefore, if we think about the implications for Brazil, this is what it will mean: reforms to national system that will lead to efficiency gain, to better value for money, to fighting corruption, to accountability and the rule of law. But also it will give further input for professionalization, for the sharing of best practices, because being part of the GPA WTO setup also means learning from other partners, which I think is an important value per se of the GPA. Now, I'm by no means a supporter of free trade, but I think it's important, free trade per se, without any guarantee, without any limitation, without any safeguard. But we need to recognize that these are possible benefits, and it's up entirely to Brazil to identify, through an accurate market analysis, identify what are the sectors which they would be benefit from and would be benefit from the most, and that therefore would be worthwhile including within the GPA coverage. Now, would the GPA be a constraint for the use of sustainable procurement policies? Now, if we need to consider a couple of things. First of all, that it is essential that Brazil retains many of the very good practices that it already has to support its small businesses. Think, for example, the field of food procurement, how important have been the policies to support farmers, or as you, Cristiana, were mentioning, the SMEs policies. So is it possible to pursue? Well, yeah, the GPA is very flexible in that respect, because only procurement that is covered by the agreement will be bound by this rule. So this is the first very rule that we need to take into account. So the very first way for Brazil to continue to maintain some preferential policies would be to limit the scope of coverage and to exclude certain entities from its coverage, or even to allow exceptions to the coverage itself. Now, if it were to be the case that certain entities are still covered, what is the scope? Now, I can't really, because of time, go and dwell much into this, but it is the revised text of the GPA is much more flexible in that respect. So, for example, if we think about Article 10 on technical specification and tender documentation, it does specifically the revised text of the GPA, the 2012 text, it allows the possibility to include environmental policies within the technical specification. And also, we need to consider the rules of the GPA within the broader international context in which they are placed, and the great favor that there is nowadays for using procurement as a development tool. So from that respect, I would think that any fear is exaggerated, and that the GPA is perfectly compatible with a use of procurement to support development. However, regardless of the rules, one thing that we always need to remember is that sustainable procurement cannot be enhanced without professionalization, without sharing of best practices and alignment to best practices. Collaboration between suppliers and procurement entities is necessary and is ever more necessary across the globe. So in that respect, the harmonization role that the GPA can play is quite significant. And now, very, very quickly, would that lead to the use of country system? That is another very important element for development that we need to consider. Now, any procurement that is linked to development aid is excluded from the GPA coverage because of an exception that is present within the GPA. However, recently, since 2005, donors have been pushing for an agenda of the use of country system. Brazil was one of the countries selected by the World Bank for a pilot on the use of country system. And at the time, Brazil failed the pilot. So will things change? Will the reforms that Brazil will implement because of the accession to the GPA change the perception that donors have respect to Brazil's capacity to carry out procurement by itself? Will it lead to more use of country system? Will it lead to more aid being donated as budget support? Well, if that is the case, the development impact that the GPA, that the accession of Brazil to the GPA can have can be very significant. Now, I don't have time to discuss other elements, which would be the implications for the Global South, but I think these are more evident and in front of everyone. Nor I can talk about the implications for the GPA itself as an instrument, as a regulatory tool. But I just want to thank everybody for organizing this seminar, remind you about our executive program in public procurement, and follow our news and links on our website. We'll hopefully have all these papers that have been presented collected somehow, and you will be able to access, and we will post links to the webinars as well. And certainly, these are conversations that need to continue. So I look forward to this. I look forward to more conversation about Brazil and the GPA. Thank you.
You're muted, Cristiana. Still muted, sorry.
Sorry. So first of all, thank you for your lecture, Professor Lakimia. It was a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you for your inputs. Now it's time to present some information about our next guest, Professor Butler. Professor Butler is Associate Professor in Law at the University of Nottingham, co-director of the Executive Program in Public Procurement Law and Policy, and joint general editor of the Public Procurement Law Review. So Professor Butler, thank you to join us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much and good morning. Can everybody see me first of all?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. Okay, firstly, I'd like to extend my warmest thanks to the organisers for allowing me to present today. I hope it's the first of many collaborations. I've been asked to speak about coverage of small and medium-sized enterprises under WTO GPA. I'll begin the presentation by offering some context on the treatment of SMEs within the GPA. I'll then briefly consider some of the SME measures that Cristiana has alluded to in respect of ensuring GPA compliance and good practice. Then I intend to draw on some examples from other international legal regimes to illustrate ways in which Brazil should focus on improving measures which facilitate SME access to procurement, measures that are SME friendly, rather than measures which are designed to set aside or ensure preferences and which could otherwise discriminate on grounds of nationality. Okay, can I move to the next slide? Oh, for some reason it won't move. There we are, moving to the next slide. Okay, as Cristiana indicated, no doubt Brazil would wish to introduce or continue to use SME measures. These could take any form. At the most extreme, US-style set-asides for small businesses, price preferences, encouragement of SME subcontracting, etc. So a first key question then is, does the existing GPA and will any future GPA accommodate these sorts of measures? Well, the answer to this question isn't necessarily clear, but the WTO GPA does appear to treat SMEs with a degree of caution. What is the evidence for this? Well, on a positive note, in favour of Brazil's negotiations, The facilitation of SME participation is clearly something which the WTO GPA wishes to explore. So just by way of context or background, after the 2012 revision, there was an agreement to set up a future work programme on SME treatment, and that would involve a survey of SME measures used by the signatories. On a less positive note, the work programme repeatedly emphasised the obligation of the parties under Article 22.6 rather, to avoid introducing or continuing measures that distort open procurement. So it's clearly understood that most measures that are designed to facilitate SME access in procurement will discriminate on grounds of nationality because they tend to favour domestic SMEs to the exclusion of foreign contractors. Further, it could be read that the WTO statements could suggest that new members which join should progressively phase out or discontinue or modify SME preferences. And a further note, the WTO clearly wishes to monitor SME measures and require potential notification pursuant to Article 22.5. Now, as academics have argued, and I've included a reference there on the slide, a fundamental difficulty for the GPA going forward is that such SME preferences, particularly those which aim to pursue laudable social justice objectives, for example, representation of ethnic minorities in contracts, are difficult to reconcile with the GPA's primary objective to achieve international market liberalisation. So where would this leave Brazil potentially? Well, the upshot is that ultimately an ambivalent attitude towards SME participation and SME-related measures means that new signatories may find it difficult to justify any overt SME preference measures. It's probably likely to be the case that most states won't have the kind of power to extract the kinds of accessions that the US did to reserve set-asides for small businesses, but I could be wrong. In which case, the emphasis is probably going to be on ensuring that existing SME measures minimise the risk of violating the GPA. Now, turning then to some of Brazil's measures, and Cristiana provided a very useful introduction. It's important to distinguish two things. Firstly, Brazil should obviously focus on which of its SME measures are GPA compliant. But more importantly, it should evaluate whether those measures constitute good or best procurement practice by reference to international standards. Now, I'm not an expert in Brazilian procurement law, so please do correct me and forgive my ignorance. But as you can see from the slide, I provided just one source of SME measures under Brazilian law to consider. Now, coming at Brazilian law from an outside perspective, it would appear that some of these measures are very encouraging, but others, A, are unlikely to be compliant with the GPA, and or B, could be improved. So let's just take one example that I've highlighted there on the slide, the tie-break scenario to which Cristiana referred a few minutes ago. My understanding is that in the case of a lowest price competition, if an SME submits a proposal that is equal to or is higher than another bid by up to 10%, the SME may then submit a new proposal which is lower than the lowest amount offered by the other bidder. Further, if the SME doesn't submit a new bid within a particular time frame, any other SME can then submit a bid. If there is then a tie between SMEs, there is a raffle. If there is no acceptable SME bid, only then will the contract be awarded to the original company with the lowest price. Now, to be clear, it's not for me to critique this sort of measure. However, the outside observation on GPA compliance and best practice might be as follows. Firstly, the lowest price that is offered should be the lowest price. This sort of tie-break provision seems to offer multiple opportunities in favour of SMEs to get to the lowest price. And a legitimate question to ask is, does this undermine the effectiveness of a lowest price competition? Secondly, as you recall from the lengthy recitation I've just given of the provision, if I'm correct, ultimately there seems to be lots of stages involved in this process. Ultimately, the more stages that you involve in a process, the greater there is that risk there is that process is going to be flawed or it will be subject to challenge. And then another issue is, does this potentially increase the risk of discrimination and unequal treatment? And the answer is probably. Therefore, and to answer Christiana's point, if you wish to facilitate SME preference measures of this kind, you may want to consider the extent to which they are compliant with the GPA. Alternatively, you might wish to consider moving towards SME friendly measures rather than SME measures that afford preferences to particular small companies. So by that, and we'll come on to look at examples of this in a moment, an SME friendly measure would be one that doesn't set aside contracts for SMEs. Rather, there are adaptations that are made to procurement processes to facilitate SME participation in other ways, whether that would be simplifying qualification requirements to encourage SMEs to bid, or things like division into lots. Now, I know that Brazil has certain forms of these measures. Good, that is encouraging. The emphasis will be on addressing any of the problems that currently occur with those existing measures and improving them. So I try and steer Brazil's approach towards looking at SME-friendly measures rather than the sort of direct preferential measures of the kind that we've otherwise seen with other countries such as the United States. Now, I don't propose to repeat the many often cited ways in which to improve SME participation. There are entire guides written on ways to identify and improve SME participation in public procurement. But before we look at some specific examples to take from other jurisdictions, it might be helpful to remind ourselves of just a few. The main way in which to improve SME participation, aside from actually setting aside money in the form of grants, startup grants, and other forms of loan or assistance. Widespread transparency of contract opportunities should be ensured. This means, in particular, reducing the number of contract portals, which you have to pay to access, so more freely available portals. In the case of Brazil, it probably also means a greater coordination of the federal and regional levels with respect to how contracts are advertised. So how do small companies access contract opportunities? Are they sufficiently visible? Another means that I mentioned, simply because there are arguments to say this sort of principle should be introduced in things like the UNCITRAL model law, concerns division into lots. I'll come back to look at division into lots in a moment. Another example of good practice, actually, that's been found in Brazil concerns opportunities for SMEs to work collectively on bids. So I put a reference on the slide to a useful practical guide which identifies as an example the use of cooperatives between SMEs in Brazil. To explain, in one case, instead of awarding contracts directly to individual SMEs, the contracting authority centralized its requirements within a particular region for the provision of furniture. In turn, a number of small associations of SMEs in the form of manufacturers associations grouped together. They were supported by Brazil's Small Business Assistance Service. Those associations of SMEs could then bid for these centralized requirements. Ultimately, quality was improved because each manufacturer within the cooperative didn't want to let other members of the cooperative down. So there are ways in which to improve SME participation. Those are just some examples. Now, Steve Schooner in prior correspondence suggested that we might make this important point, which is ultimately that whatever measures you seek to propose or use with SMEs, ultimately ensure that you do not compromise procurement. I would go even further and say that even if you violate international obligations by including SME preferences that might discriminate on grounds of nationality, ultimately ensure that they do not detrimentally impact your procurement. It's easy to see how well-intentioned SME measures can significantly undermine procurement processes. How? Well, I'll give just some examples. One would be dividing contracts into too many lots. And I'll discuss some of the disadvantages of dividing into lots in a few moments when I discuss examples from the European Union. Another would be dictating to contractors how they should manage their supply chains, and we'll look at some experience of Brazil in that regard. Another would be over-regulating. If you over-regulate either in legal terms or policy terms, this tends to create a perception amongst SMEs that there is too much red tape, there is too much of a regulatory burden, even if that regulatory burden is not quite as heavy as those SMEs or their industry associations would make out. My second key message then would be focus on reforming tried and tested SME-friendly measures rather than focusing too much on developing measures which aim to set aside contracts for SMEs. Now, I simply draw on the EU's experience, given the number of countries or member states that it represents. Now, just by way of context, the EU does not expressly permit small and medium-sized enterprise set-asides. If it expressly allowed these kinds of set-asides, each member state would be considered to discriminate on grounds of nationality against contractors from other member states. And this would jeopardize the ultimate objective to develop an internal market. It's one reason why historically the European Union doesn't like the US reservation of set-asides. So instead, the EU has adopted a number of non-discriminatory, what we call SME-friendly measures. These include, for example, and I've listed these on the slide, provisions requiring division into lots, simplification of qualification procedures, for example, through self-certifying your qualifying status, minimum turnover requirements, and direct payments made to subcontractors. Now, I know that Brazil already has some of these measures in place, but a quick discussion of some of the problems which haven't been properly addressed with these measures within the EU could offer an opportunity for Brazil to address some of these shortfalls in their own measures directed at these particular areas. So one of the EU's major SME-friendly measures has been to give member states the option of requiring contracting authorities to divide their contracts into lots. Now, as I've indicated, some academics have actually called for the inclusion of division into lots principles in the UNCITRAL model law, simply because these are increasingly accepted as a good SME-friendly measure. Now, that said, the extent of the problems with such measures should also be given proper recognition. Some of these will resonate within the Brazilian system. Firstly, policymakers have yet to decide whether contracting authorities should actually be forced to divide contracts into lots, i.e. whether they should be mandatory, or whether they should have discretion to divide contracts into lots. Now, this is a critical policy and regulatory choice. For example, the EU 2014 Directive on Public Sector Procurement permits member states to require contracting authorities to divide contract into lots. However, it's not mandatory for contracting authorities to do so. Rather, contracting authorities have the option of dividing contracts into lots. Crucially, if they do not divide contracts into lots, they have to explain why they haven't done so. Now, in the EU, this has become problematic because A, why should you be required to explain how you have organised the allocation of your contract if you're a contracting authority? B, the reasons that you give will either be obvious, or C, you won't give very clear reasons if you're a contracting authority. And D, what is the consequence if you fail to divide the contract into lots, and how should this be determined? Another problem with dividing contracts into lots is that it can result in highly inefficient procurement processes, and this reinforces the key message. Do not use these measures to undermine your procurement process inadvertently. There have been horror stories of instances in which a contract for a single requirement has been broken up into so many elements as to be simply unmanageable, with huge additions of costs and time. Further, if you do divide contracts into lots, you have to make sure that you apply thresholds rules properly. So if you set thresholds above which full detailed procurement procedures should apply, there is a risk that contracting authorities may be incentivized to divide contracts into lots to avoid the contracts meeting the thresholds. As a result of these attempts to avoid contract thresholds, anti-avoidance rules and aggregation of purchases rules have to be brought in to prevent this. And this can be very difficult to police. Ultimately, bidders can also game the system through a divide and conquer approach. They can decide which lots they wish to bid for and break them up accordingly. There's also the problem of allocation. So if one particular bidder is awarded a number of lots, should there be a limit to the number of those lots? And should they be able to offer a lower price on some lots if they receive a package of lots? Now, reading some of the Brazilian rules on this and some of the commentary around it, these are the same sorts of problems that have and could arise in respect of rules applied in Brazil. So Brazil might wish to reflect on how these sorts of universal problems could be improved in its use of SME-friendly measures of this kind. Now, I'm just going to give one other anecdotal example from the EU, which is often not mentioned, but it's an example of some of the problems that you can encounter when you overregulate and start dictating to contractors how they should manage their supply chains. This should be relevant to Brazil because I note that in Brazil, unless I'm mistaken, there are measures to encourage contractors to use SMEs as subcontractors. These measures seem to go as far as telling contractors to subcontract up to 30% of the contract with the threat of disqualification if this is not offered. Well, the EU, albeit in one particular context, has adopted a similar measure with deleterious effects. Now, by way of context, in 2009, the EU adopted a Defence and Security Procurement Directive. Ultimately, the EU was very concerned about the risk that member states, when awarding defence contracts to foreign contractors, might try and compensate by requiring the foreign contractor to subcontract work on that contract to domestic industry. Obviously, this discriminates against foreign contractors on grounds of nationality and prevents subcontracts from being opened up to EU-wide competition. So the EU introduced an extraordinary set of options. I've included these on the slide, from green being the least severe to red being the most. In essence, these options enable a contracting authority to determine, 1, how much of the contract the prime contractor must subcontract, 2, which parts of the contract must be subcontracted, 3, who to subcontract to, and even 4, a minimum or maximum percentage of subcontracts which a prime contractor must open up to competition. So this is an attempt by a legislator to get contracting authorities to tell contractors how to subcontract. Now, it's telling that virtually none of the EU member states took up these options. Why? Well, firstly, a prevalent view was that it was a step too far for contracting authorities to dictate how contractors organise their supply chains, especially when it would lead to the breakup of those supply chains in instances where trust between suppliers and subcontractors had been built up over a number of years. And secondly, and very simply, the provisions are complex and contracting authorities want to use options that are easy to apply. So again, I would encourage Brazil to think carefully about any measures that interfere with how suppliers organise and allocate their contracts. I'm conscious of time, but I simply include a final example. One thing that repeatedly strikes me as potentially useful is to use contract value thresholds as a way of introducing proportionate SME-friendly measures. So one example that I can give in the UK is the UK Lord Young reforms. As you may know, as a former EU member state, the UK largely copied and pasted EU procurement rules into its national law. However, it did introduce some of its own national rules and policies to boost SMEs. Now, I won't go through all of these on the slide, but just to give one or two examples, as we know, lengthy qualification exercises can discourage SMEs from bidding. So the UK has provided that for contracts above a certain threshold, a standard pre-qualification questionnaire should be used. This standard questionnaire streamlines the number and type of questions a supplier should answer to be deemed qualified. And then another is a formal pre-qualification stage was removed altogether for contracts below a certain threshold. Instead, they would be asked questions at a single stage in their selection process in accordance with a prescribed government policy. And if there was any deviation from this simplified process by a contracting authority, it would have to be reported. So there are ways to creatively use thresholds to provide for proportionate SME-friendly measures. In conclusion then, facilitating SME participation is complex, For understandable reasons, the WTO GPA does not have a clearly committed view on SME measures. This necessarily creates uncertainty in introducing or continuing SME measures on succession. Secondly, do not simply evaluate whether Brazil's SME measures are GPA compliant. Do they represent good or best practice? Thirdly, SME measures should not undermine the procurement process, even if they may undermine international trade. Fourthly, existing techniques are by no means simple to apply. Division into lots is one example, and some remain controversial, for example, directed controls on subcontracting. There are ways to use regulation to facilitate proportionate SME-friendly measures. And to echo Anna's brief advertisement, we do run an executive programme in public procurement law and policy, where we would very much hope to discuss these matters with you in person. Thank you very much for your time.
I'm not getting any sound from you, Cristiana.
What about now? Oh, okay. So thank you, Professor Butler, for highlighting some important aspects of the topic, and also for pointing some deviations that, of course, we can notice considering this kind of rules, this kind of policy. I would like to, we know that this kind of policy can cause or can provoke some distortions. We know about this, and we have some rules that try to avoid this kind of mistake. Let me say this way. In few words, I would like to, I don't know if it's to inform or to highlight that under our national law, it's not mandatory to subcontract, so it's an option. It is still an option, and that the division here into lots, it's mandatory, as you said, but the public agent could explain and could make a different choice. So it's mandatory in some way, but of course there is room for a different choice, a different behavior, if the public agent is capable of explaining that in that case, the division would or could provoke inefficiency, okay? And to conclude our debate, we have the pleasure to listen to Professor Schooner, who is Professor of Government Procurement Law at George Washington University, where I have been for a while as a visiting scholar. I miss it so much. He previously served as a senior procurement policy official in the White House, and he has advised government officials on public procurement issues in more than 30 countries. It's all yours, Professor Schooner. You are mute.
I believe I'm unmuted now, yes?
No, now it's okay.
Okay, so first let me say thank you for the organizers for the opportunity to participate. And let me say what a pleasure it is to follow Cristiana and Annamaria and Luke, all who have made a number of very, very helpful points. I want to echo one thing to begin that Luke said a couple of times and in concluding, and that is, regardless of your aspirations with regard to the government procurement agreement, I hope that you will continue to put good procurement first. Let's keep in mind that the intention and the general perception of the World Trade Organization's government procurement agreement is that it is a template of procurement best practices. So I would never encourage you to do anything in pursuit of accession to the GPA that is not consistent with what you perceive as good procurement practices. In addition to that, I also want to point out that there are innumerable nuances, and as Luke and Annamaria pointed out earlier, there are going to be a number of things where significant study is going to be significant. So for example, Luke spoke at length about some of these subcontracting practices we see around the world. Many of these, for example, in the United States, implicate other GPA requirements, such as the prohibition on offsets. So there are many, many ways that these issues play out, but I think if as your touchstone, you focus most on good procurement, you'll end up in the right place one way or another. Okay, now let me begin, and if you don't remember anything else I say today, what I really want you to think about as this process begins, this negotiated accession process, is the GPA members want you to pursue accession and they want you to succeed. And so I want to use or share with you, and many of you have seen this, a map that is often used by the World Trade Organization when they talk about GPA membership. If you look at the small map, you'll see that the green are the GPA members, the yellow are the GPA observers. But think about how significantly different the global trading community looks if Brazil transitions from yellow to green. In other words, there are significant incentives for the members to have you join. In addition, and I don't know if this has been discussed in these seminars or not, but I think that most experts would tell you that the first mover in any particular region tends to get the best deal. So the sooner that you succeed, the odds are that you will gain more flexibility, because the members hope that you will bring other members of the region in with you. Now, to the extent that I'm following Annamaria and Luke, I'm going to try to build on some of their discussions and then introduce some other topics. But I really want to bring you back to this issue of the thresholds and the need for data, which I'll talk about more later. It is incredibly important for you to be able to understand empirically what the volume of your procurement transactions are above and below the general GPA thresholds and the thresholds that you negotiate. I think you need to know both the number of transactions and the amount of money changing hands above and below those thresholds, because in most countries, the primary target of opportunity for your SMEs is going to be below the thresholds anyway, at which point the GPA has no relevance whatsoever. It will not require you to change your behaviors at all below the thresholds. Second, and I'm sure it will be discussed in other webinars, but it's important for your negotiating team to not only understand, but to maximize the transitional measures that are built into the GPA. If you need to begin with a higher threshold and then work down over a few years, that's definitely something worth discussing. And also, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but rest assured that there is nothing in the GPA that is an impediment to your sustainability agenda. And I'll talk a little bit more about sustainability in just a moment. But ultimately, I really encourage you to negotiate aggressively in this process. Okay. All right, now, I think one of the most important things that's so important for your negotiating team and your state as you think about this process is good data so that you can make informed decision making. Now, one of the things that we often find in procurement is that many states make decisions without the data, and therefore they often generalize, they overreact to anecdotes, and sometimes they act based on myths. One of the things that for many countries they find is working through the negotiation process gives them an opportunity to not only improve, but to think more critically about their procurement data. The biggest takeaway I want you to focus on here is as you evolve or look more critically at your data collection and analytical systems, focus more on what you get for your money or procurement outcomes, and try to focus less on procurement process. I'll come back to this in just a moment. But in terms of what you really want to know with the data, you want more data on whether you received value for money when you spent the money, rather than more data on what steps you took to spend your money. Okay, so just to build on that a little bit. In the United States, where we have collected more procurement data for longer than any country in the world, one of the things that we've learned is we've become very good at measuring what's easy to measure and not very good at measuring what matters. So for example, we know how many transactions we have, we know how much money we spent, we know where the money went, we know whether contractors complete on time, we know how many SMEs participated, we know whether prices are high or prices are low. But I want you to think for just a moment about what consumers care about when they spend their money. What we have little or no data on in the United States, and indeed what most countries lack in terms of data, are what I would call market-based metrics. In other words, when I spent money, did I get value for the money I spent? Did I use the things I purchased? Did they work? Did they meet my needs? Was I happy with them? And we often express this value proposition in terms of customer satisfaction. The private sector fully understands the criticality of assessing customer satisfaction, and their metrics generally focus on that much more than the government's. One of the most critical things that I encourage you to do as you go through the steps of procurement reform then is to focus, or at least start to think about and train your government officials to think in terms of life cycle cost or total cost of ownership, rather than obsessing on purchase prices. So to build on that just a little bit, I apologize, I'm going to go out of order just for a moment. To build on that just a moment, you may buy something and it may be very, very inexpensive. You may have gotten a terrific price, but if you didn't use it, or it didn't work, or it didn't last, that's not going to be a value. Consumers think about when they spent money, whether it meant their need. What we've been encouraging procurement professionals for a number of years to be thinking about instead, though, is to think in terms of life cycle cost rather than purchase price. So when an economist says life cycle cost, what they tend to do is think in terms of purchase price, transaction costs, how much did you spend running your procurement operation? Operating costs, for example, for an automobile, how much do you spend on fuel or petrol and oil and tires? Maintenance costs, how much money do you spend over the useful life of what you purchased, fixing it or replacing it? And then, of course, disposition costs can be very, very important, because disposition costs can be a positive or a negative number. If you have a resale, you recoup some of your money, driving down your life cycle cost. But if you have to dispose of something that has significant waste associated with it, you have additional costs at the end of its useful life. All of which brings me to the issue of externalities, and I want to go back then just for a second. We haven't talked very much about sustainability, but of course, as we all know, the most significant issue for our children, for the next generation, for future governments, will be addressing climate change. And therefore, all of our countries are going to need to think more creatively about how to integrate sustainability into our procurement. I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is there is nothing inconsistent with the sustainability agenda and the GPA requirements. But we do need to think about sustainability as part of our value proposition. The only way we can do that is if we avoid the tyranny of low price, or we avoid falling into the trap of chasing the false economy of low price. For example, in my country and in your country, fossil fuel solutions have been subsidized for many, many years. So in a low price world, we often find ourselves choosing a solution which is not good for the environment. There's many examples we see in the marketplace, but think about how it is that many of our states increased consumers to purchase hybrid or electric vehicles. They gave them tax credits or refunds, which offset the increased prices, or they created express or consumer lanes that created value for them. All of which brings me back to the life cycle cost issue, because here we need to think about the sustainability agenda in terms of externalities. In other words, when I'm doing my market research, when I'm advertising, when I'm evaluating different offers, I need to think about the price that I'm going to pay versus the conventional life cycle cost elements, but also think about sustainability considerations. In other words, when I pay a price premium for a non-fossil fuel solution, what are the other benefits to my community in terms of better air quality, possibly reduced healthcare costs, if I go to public transportation, if that saves my citizenry, my public time in terms of their transportation? How do I factor all of those costs in? And we need to be a little bit more creative. But let me be unequivocally clear, this is harder work than the classic objective analysis associated with low price. Many of our countries have favored low price solutions because it's easier to train our procurement professionals to address them. All of which brings me to the last major point I'd like to make today, and that is, as you think about procurement reform, as you engage in the steps with the government procurement agreement community, it always raises the issue of the professionalization of our acquisition or our procurement workforce. Ultimately, this brings us back to one of the hardest issues to address, and that is, in procurement, it's all about people. Another way to think of that is you can write a perfect procurement law, but if the people who work in that system don't follow the rules or understand what you're trying to achieve, the odds are you're not going to gain success. Let me also suggest to you just for a moment that in procurement, the ultimate goal we're getting to is for the government to enter into contracts with the private sector. What's a contract? A contract is a legal relationship, and relationships are difficult to manage. They're all about trust, and establishing and maintaining trust is difficult, and therefore we're going to need to continue to professionalize our acquisition workforce so that we understand the importance of relationships during performance of contracts. We also understand that humans are flawed and they sometimes misbehave. Nothing in procurement is going to change human nature, so we need to address those issues as well. But in all of this, as we reform our procurement systems, it's incredibly important to keep in mind that it's much harder to change culture and behavior than it is to change rules. So we need to think creatively about change management as we evolve our procurement systems. Ultimately, procurement is a team sport. It's a large and diverse team, and we need to make sure that the people who are engaged in procurement understand what the government's aspirations are, understand what their responsibilities are, but also understand the government's needs so that they can help them achieve their missions. But as you see from this webinar, and as you'll see during the GPA accession process, you don't need to go this alone. There are wonderful capacity building initiatives and lessons learned from around the world. Luke and Annamaria have plenty of examples from other countries in their presentations as well. But I encourage you to think about the GPA negotiating and trading community as a true community. And one of the wonderful things that's happened in procurement in the last couple of decades is we've been able to share lessons learned. We've been able to learn from other countries' mistakes and successes. And frankly, in the long run, I think that makes it a little bit easier for all of us. So throughout this process, I want to go back to where Luke was in making the point that as you pursue GPA accession, figure out what works for your country, figure out what works for your procurement system, but understand that good procurement which is incredibly important to good governance, is going to come first, and make sure you don't do anything that isn't consistent with that. Again, thank you so much for including me, and I look forward to discussing any of these issues with you.
So thank you very much, Professor Schooner, and especially I would like to thank you to remind us that rules are not capable of changing or to how can I say, to change the reality if we don't focus on people. We have to focus always on people, on public agents. This should be our main concern. Now we have some additional time. So if you want to make any comments or to bring some additional information, some inputs, you have a free time for this. I don't know if you want to do it.
I mean, I don't mind starting because I think we all touched on it, but I think that the issue of SMEs is one where we could have unlimited discussion. And if there's one point I wanted to make above all others, and I apologize, in retrospect, I probably should have included this in my slides. There are many ways that governments can support domestic SMEs without disturbing the procurement process. And another way to think about that is there isn't really any empirical research, frankly, anywhere in the world that suggests that overturning your procurement process to support your small and medium enterprises really works. One of the worst things that happens in procurement is when you close markets to your small businesses, they know the market is closed, they don't evolve, and they don't stay competitive, and you pay price premiums that are non-productive. Conversely, there are many things that governments can do, and Luke addressed some of them. But I think, for example, training is wonderful, mentoring, particularly from larger and successful businesses, lending programs so that small and medium enterprises can get access to ready capital, often guaranteed by the government. And then, of course, there's always the issues associated with anything related to, literally just, exposing the best practices. So as Luke talked about, information access, the more transparent you are, the easier it is for small businesses to get access to the information. But again, what I really discourage you from doing is believing that somehow the GPA trading community is going to upset the SME regime. As Luke mentioned, many governments have aggressive subcontracting programs, but the reality is everyone shares the concerns, but the trading community itself is not the impediment to you doing what are best practices with regard to your SMEs.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Professor Lakimia, Professor Butler, you want to make any additional comment?
Thank you very much, Cristiana. Just very quickly to re-emphasize and reiterate the importance of negotiations, how important it is at this stage for Brazil to negotiate an accession that is convenient for Brazil, because as Stephen was saying later on, they can always lower the thresholds afterwards. They can always modify the accession. They can always make more concessions. I mean, seeing the map that Stephen was showing, it's quite significant to see what it might mean for Brazil to access the GPA. And, I was saying at the beginning that the accession of Brazil to the GPA has been defined as an historical event because of its significance for the whole of Latin America. So I think that this really needs to be borne in mind. And also, let's remember that with any other, Luke and Stephen have focused a lot on SMEs, but it's the same with any other sustainability policies. These can be pursued through procurement. There is no significant obstacle within the GPA. The GPA thus complies with modern international standards of procurement and of regulation. These sustainability policies are now accepted everywhere. We need to work as a normality towards sustainable procurement, towards policies that are environmentally friendly. So I think that if anything, harmonizing the rules and compliance, it will push companies to comply, and therefore it will be easier and easier to pursue such policies through the GPA as well. And it's testament as well all the work that the GPA committees are doing on these issues. They wouldn't be doing such work if it wasn't possible within the rules. So I think this is something that we need to remember.
Could I just add one quick thing on that, because I think Annamaria made a wonderful point before Luke jumps in. I can't emphasize enough the importance of access to good data, and when I talk about data, particularly understanding your domestic economy and your export capacity. As Annamaria pointed out, every aspect of the annex that Brazil will eventually agree to under the GPA is negotiable. Every ministry, every threshold, every government at the central and subcentral level is in play. And the most sophisticated negotiators spend a lot of time comparing the various annexes from countries around the world. And what many people often do is they say, on one end of the spectrum, look at Singapore's annex. Singapore basically says, we'll just do free trade, okay? It's wonderful, it's a great model. At the other end of the spectrum, look at the United States or look at Israel. Every ministry, every type of procurement, every threshold, everything is basically geared to the specific needs and shall we say, traits or characteristics of that domestic economy. But it's all out there on the WTO GPA webpage. Every member's annex is there, and you can see which models work for you. Positive lists, negative lists, higher thresholds, transitional measures. Again, information is power.
Absolutely.
So, okay, besides this suggestion that regards behave or negotiate aggressively, is there any other suggestion or any other recipe for success? This will be one question. And I was wondering if you could both, or you can decide who can point to us, who can summarize to us normally which kind of legal adjustments are required to how can I say, to allow the assessment. If there is any kind of how can I say, any kind of suggestion that you can give to us about this topic.
So I'm going to say a couple of things, and I'm sure Luke and Annamaria will want to add here as well. There are many approaches around the world. Some states have done all of their procurement reform first and then done their accession based on those reforms. Some have negotiated the aspiration that they believe they need to get to and then done the legal reforms afterwards. As a general rule, I think the member states don't really care which of those approaches you take. But let me stop there and let Luke and Annamaria chime in, and then I'll go wherever else you want. But in terms of success, the reality is it's a negotiation. The easiest way to succeed is just agree to everything the United States and the EU asks for, but that would be ridiculous. So on the one end, you've got a Singapore type model. Okay, we'll just do everything. On the other end, you have China, who's been negotiating for many, many years. As a general rule, it's easier for small and simple economies, but my personal opinion, and I believe this opinion is shared in Geneva as well, is that Brazil has a sophisticated procurement system. You are members of many regional procurement agreements which are fully consistent with the GPA. My personal belief is the amount of change actually required is very, very minimal. And I think that except for at the subcentral and municipal level and with regard to thresholds, I think your negotiation could go quite easily, but that's just my opinion.
Okay.
Yeah,
But
my only view would be, of course, I couldn't quite discern to what extent Brazil was looking for extensive reservation of set-asides of the US kind, or whether the sorts of SME measures that you were looking at retaining or introducing would be far more subtle. So I don't know whether Steve has got any views on the likelihood of Brazil being able to include big style US reservation set-asides for small businesses, whether Brazil has got a fighting chance at introducing those or retaining those sorts of measures, or if not, it will just be a case of incremental changes, which won't require massive legal changes, to just ensure that the existing SME friendly measures that you've got in place are compliant. But the EU has I've identified all the problems with the EU rules. The EU isn't going to reform them to make those GPA compliant or compliant with EU law. So I'm not suggesting that for a moment. I was suggesting any tweaks that you do make to your existing SME friendly measures would simply be for the benefit of improving your procurement practice, really, which is why I mentioned GPA compliance and improving procurement practice. It's mainly to improve your procurement practice. But yeah, I don't know if Steve's got a view, and I don't know whether Brazil wants to go for big set-asides. As far as I can see, that's not Brazilian law. Brazilian law actually is far more subtle in the preferences that it uses than we just set aside X number of contracts for certain types of groups, but I could be wrong. I don't know if Steve had any thoughts on that.
So just a quick word on negotiation strategy. And now we're no longer talking about law. We're just talking about interpersonal negotiation strategy and the like. What is it that the GPA members want? They want access. They want to be able to compete for your biggest and most important procurements. As a general rule, EU members and American firms are not really interested in trying to compete for small value procurements in rural Brazil. I mean, this is one of the most frustrating things about having watched the Chinese negotiations with the GPA over the years. The United States and the EU dug in with China on subcentral governments. As I have said for many, many years, if China only joined at the central government level and their 10 largest municipalities, it would still be one of the biggest economies in the world, and it would dramatically expand the GPA trading community. The idea that EU and US negotiators are fighting about access to small municipalities that they can't even find on a map, to me is delusional. I do not believe that GPA member state firms are worried about that marketplace. So, higher thresholds and transitional measures. If someone sits down and says, if you get access to all of our procurements above this threshold, this is what the economy looks like. And while it's true there are millions of transactions below those thresholds, each of those opportunities on average are worth nothing. People, it's not worth it. So literally engaging with the data to make this discussion meaningful in terms of opportunity versus opportunity cost, to me, is everything. And going back to Luke's point, I honestly do not believe that seriously, intellectually, the GPA member states are worried about competing with your domestic SMEs for most of the contracts that they get. It doesn't make any economic sense.
Okay, thank you. What about you, Professor Lakimia? Any other comments?
Well, just to add that I think that for every norm and for every international agreement, I think one way of understanding it and understand what your role is and where you're placed is to understand it's a epistemological foundation and how the norms were created, how they were formed, who is behind it, what were the parties that negotiated the agreement, how they did it. I mean, Stephen had already talked about looking at the annexes negotiations for the other parties. That really helps to understand what works, what might not work for you. And I think that this is the conscious points that Brazil and any other developing country needs to make when deciding to access that agreement, is really asking, why am I accessing? What are the benefits? And take it from there. And only this will lead to success.
Okay, thank you. Let me check if we have any questions from the audience. No questions. So I once again want to thank you for your participation, and I want to thank you for helping us understanding the main issues related to small business and GPA. In my opinion, this is the most important panel of the webinar because it touches in our main concern about join GPA, about being a member of this agreement. So thank you all, and I hope that we can see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
very much.
Cristiana.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thank you. Bye.
Be safe.